The last thing 18-year-old Emily Carter heard before the front door slammed shut was her mother's voice telling her not to come back. A few seconds later, the porch light went dark. Just like that, the place she had called home her entire life was no longer hers. She stood there holding a trash bag filled with clothes, a worn backpack hanging from one shoulder, and less than $40 in her pocket. It was a cold night, but the temperature wasn't what she remembered years later. What stayed with her was the feeling of realizing that the two people who were supposed to protect her had decided she was completely on her own. What Emily didn't know that night was that the same parents who abandoned her at 18 would spend years searching for answers they didn't want to face. And one day, they would find themselves standing exactly where she once stood, wondering how everything had fallen apart. For years, people in town believed the Carters were the kind of family everyone wished they had. They lived in a quiet neighborhood where neighbors waved from their driveways and children rode bicycles until sunset. Emily's father, David Carter, was respected in the community. Her mother, Susan Carter, volunteered at local events and seemed to know everyone. From the outside, they looked successful, responsible, and deeply committed to family values. If you had asked anyone who knew them back then, they probably would have described them as loving parents raising two children in a stable home. Yet appearances can be powerful. Sometimes they become so convincing that even the people living inside the story start believing them. Emily spent years trying to convince herself that everything was normal. She wanted to believe that every harsh criticism was meant to help her. She wanted to believe every punishment was deserved. She wanted to believe that eventually she would earn the same approval that seemed to come so easily to her younger brother, Ryan. Before we go deeper into the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Looking back, Emily often described her childhood as a constant competition she never understood. No matter how hard she worked in school, Ryan's achievements received more attention. No matter how many responsibilities she handled at home, her mistakes seemed to carry more weight. When report cards arrived, Emily's good grades were treated as expectations, while Ryan's average grades were celebrated as accomplishments. When family members gathered for holidays, conversations often centered around Ryan's future, Ryan's hobbies, Ryan's interests. Emily learned early that being responsible did not guarantee recognition. Instead, it often meant being asked to do even more. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Children naturally look for fairness, and when they don't find it, they often blame themselves. Emily convinced herself she simply needed to try harder. She believed that one day her parents would notice her efforts and finally treat her differently. What she didn't realize was that the problem had never been her effort. As the years passed, subtle differences became impossible to ignore. Ryan was given freedoms Emily never received. Rules seemed flexible when they applied to him but rigid when they applied to her. If Ryan broke something, excuses were made. If Emily made a mistake, lectures followed. Friends noticed it. Relatives occasionally noticed it. Yet nobody said much because family dynamics can be difficult to challenge from the outside. Emily learned to stay quiet. She focused on school. She found comfort in books and long walks. She dreamed about college and the possibility of building a future beyond the limits of her hometown. More than anything, she wanted independence. She wanted the chance to prove that she was capable of creating a life on her own terms. What she didn't know was that events were already moving toward a confrontation that would change everything. By the time Emily reached her senior year of high school, tensions inside the Carter household had become harder to hide. Financial stress had entered the picture. Bills were piling up. Arguments between her parents became more frequent. Doors slammed. Voices carried through walls. Conversations stopped abruptly whenever Emily entered a room. Nobody explained what was happening, but she could feel the pressure growing. Families under stress often look for solutions. Sometimes they look for someone to blame. Emily didn't understand it then, but she was slowly becoming the easiest target. Whenever something went wrong, criticism found its way to her. Decisions she had nothing to do with somehow became her responsibility. Small disagreements turned into major conflicts. The atmosphere inside the house changed from uncomfortable to exhausting. Every day felt like walking across a frozen lake, never knowing which step might cause the surface beneath her to crack. Then came the argument. Years later, family members would remember it differently. Some claimed it started over money. Others insisted it was about rules. A few would say it was simply the result of years of frustration finally reaching a breaking point. What everyone agreed on was the outcome. That night changed everything. Voices echoed through the house. Old grievances resurfaced. Words were spoken that could never be taken back. Emily stood in the living room listening as years of disappointment, resentment, and misunderstanding poured out from every direction. Then her father delivered an ultimatum. To him, it probably felt like a demand made in the heat of the moment. To Emily, it sounded final. When she refused to surrender her plans for the future, the situation escalated. Within hours, she found herself carrying a trash bag of belongings toward the front door. And when that door closed behind her, a chapter of her life ended in a way she never could have imagined. The first few minutes after the door closed felt unreal. Emily stood on the sidewalk staring at the house where she had spent her entire childhood. The windows were still lit. The television was still on inside. Life was continuing as though nothing had happened. For a moment, she expected the door to open again. She expected her father, David Carter, to step outside and tell her to come back in. She expected her mother, Susan Carter, to calm down and admit that everyone had said things they didn't mean. But neither of those things happened. The house remained silent. Cars occasionally passed on the street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Emily tightened her grip on the trash bag containing most of what she owned and started walking. She had no destination in mind. She simply knew she couldn't stay there. Every step carried her farther away from the only home she had ever known and closer to a future she wasn't prepared for. That night, Emily called 3 different friends. The first didn't answer. The second apologized and explained that her parents wouldn't allow anyone to stay over. The third hesitated before agreeing to let Emily sleep on a couch for a few nights. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get through the immediate crisis. As she sat in the passenger seat of her friend's car, exhaustion began to replace shock. Her mind replayed the argument over and over again. She kept searching for the moment when everything had gone wrong. Maybe she could have stayed quieter. Maybe she could have chosen different words. Maybe she could have walked away before the situation escalated. Yet no matter how many times she replayed the events, she always arrived at the same conclusion. The argument may have triggered the explosion, but the real damage had been building for years. This wasn't one bad night. It was the result of a family dynamic that had been slowly breaking apart for a very long time. The following weeks were some of the hardest of Emily's life. She moved between spare bedrooms, couches, and temporary arrangements. Every morning began with the same question. Where would she stay next week? Every evening ended with the same fear. What if nobody could help her anymore? While many teenagers spent their final months of high school thinking about graduation parties and summer plans, Emily was focused on survival. She worked part-time shifts whenever possible. She saved every dollar she could. She learned how quickly money disappeared when every expense mattered. More importantly, she learned how differently people treated someone who had nowhere to go. Some offered kindness without hesitation. Others looked at her with suspicion, assuming she must have done something terrible to be kicked out by her own parents. That assumption hurt more than she wanted to admit, because deep down, she was still asking herself the same question. Had she somehow deserved what happened? Meanwhile, life inside the Carter household continued. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. David Carter went to work. Susan Carter maintained appearances around town. Ryan continued living at home. To neighbors, everything seemed normal. Yet cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. Family secrets have a way of demanding attention eventually. Problems ignored for years rarely disappear on their own. What Emily didn't know was that the financial pressure affecting her parents had become far worse than anyone realized. Debt had accumulated quietly. Bills had been hidden. Decisions made years earlier were now producing consequences that could no longer be avoided. David and Susan spent increasing amounts of time arguing behind closed doors. The stress that had contributed to Emily's removal from the household was still there. The difference was that Emily was no longer available to absorb the blame. As months turned into a year, Emily began rebuilding her life piece by piece. She graduated despite the obstacles. She worked longer hours. She enrolled in community college classes when she could afford them. Nothing came easily. Every achievement required sacrifice. There were nights when she questioned whether the struggle was worth it. There were mornings when she woke up feeling completely exhausted before the day even began. Yet each challenge forced her to become stronger. The confidence she had spent years searching for slowly emerged. She stopped measuring her value through her parents' approval. She stopped waiting for an apology that never came. For the first time, she started making decisions based on what she wanted rather than what she thought might please someone else. Then something unexpected happened. A manager at one of her jobs noticed her work ethic and offered her a larger opportunity. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't life-changing overnight, but it provided stability. Emily accepted immediately. She learned new skills, took on additional responsibilities, and earned the respect of people who judged her based on performance rather than family history. The opportunity opened another door, then another. Within a few years, the teenager who had once been sleeping on couches was building a career she never imagined possible. The progress wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines. Yet every milestone represented something important. Each success reminded her that she had survived without the support of the people who were supposed to help her most. Back in her hometown, however, the Carter family was moving in a very different direction. Financial troubles continued growing. The image David and Susan had spent years protecting became harder to maintain. Relationships with friends and relatives became strained. Ryan, the son who had always received special treatment, struggled with responsibilities he had never fully learned to manage. The balance inside the family shifted in ways nobody anticipated. For years, everyone had assumed Emily needed the family. Gradually, evidence suggested the opposite might have been true. The person they dismissed had been one of the strongest members of the household all along. Then, nearly 7 years after the night Emily was forced to leave, a letter arrived at her apartment. At first glance, it looked ordinary. There was no return address she recognized. No explanation for why it had been sent. Yet the contents would force Emily to confront questions she thought she had left behind forever. Because hidden inside that envelope was information about the Carter family that had remained buried for decades. Information that would change how Emily viewed her parents, her childhood, and the night she was thrown out of the house. And for the first time since she walked away from that front porch, Emily realized she might never have known the full truth about what happened. The envelope sat on Emily Carter's kitchen table for nearly 2 days before she finally opened it. Part of her wanted to throw it away and continue living the life she had spent years building. Another part couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was inside might answer questions she had carried since the night David Carter and Susan Carter forced her out of their home. When she finally unfolded the pages, she immediately recognized the handwriting. It belonged to her Aunt Rebecca, her mother's older sister. Emily hadn't spoken to her in years. The letter began with an apology. Then it moved into something far more unsettling. Rebecca explained that she had remained silent for too long and that age had made her realize some truths needed to be told before it was too late. According to the letter, the story Emily had believed about her childhood was incomplete. There were events that happened long before she was born, decisions made by adults who thought they were protecting their family, and secrets that had shaped her life without her knowledge. Rebecca wrote that if Emily truly wanted answers, she should meet her in person. For days, Emily debated whether she should go. She had spent years creating distance between herself and the pain of her childhood. Opening old wounds carried risks. Yet curiosity eventually won. A week later, she drove 3 hours to a small town where Rebecca lived. The woman who greeted her looked older than she remembered, but her eyes carried the same warmth Emily had known as a child. After exchanging awkward greetings, they sat at a kitchen table and began a conversation that would last for hours. Rebecca started by describing Susan Carter's early adulthood. Long before Emily was born, Susan had dreamed of a different life. She wanted success, stability, and respect. She desperately feared failure because she had grown up in a household where financial insecurity affected nearly every decision. According to Rebecca, those fears never truly disappeared. Instead, they followed Susan into adulthood and influenced nearly everything she did. When financial pressures emerged years later, those old fears resurfaced with incredible force. But that wasn't the revelation that stunned Emily. The real shock came when Rebecca explained that Susan had never fully recovered from losing a child years before Emily was born. Emily sat frozen. Rebecca continued carefully. Years before Emily's birth, Susan and David had been expecting a baby. Complications during pregnancy ended in tragedy. The loss devastated both parents. They rarely discussed it afterward. Over time, they tried to move forward, eventually welcoming Emily into the world. Yet Rebecca believed Susan's grief never truly healed. Instead, it transformed into anxiety, control, and emotional distance. While Rebecca wasn't excusing Susan's behavior, she believed it explained part of it. For years, Susan had been living with unresolved pain while pretending everything was fine. The pressure affected her relationships, her marriage, and eventually her children. Emily listened quietly, trying to process everything. The information didn't erase the hurt she experienced growing up, but it introduced complexity where she had once seen only cruelty. Then Rebecca revealed something even more surprising. The journals Emily had kept throughout her teenage years weren't the only records documenting life inside the Carter household. Rebecca handed her a box filled with letters, notes, and personal writings spanning decades. Some belonged to family members. Others belonged to Susan herself. As Emily read through them over the following weeks, patterns began emerging. The documents painted a picture of a family struggling beneath the surface for far longer than anyone realized. Financial problems, marital tension, fear of public embarrassment, and unresolved grief had all combined to create an environment where blame became easier than accountability. The more Emily learned, the more she understood that the night she was thrown out wasn't caused by a single argument. It was the final result of years of emotional damage nobody wanted to confront. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. Emily's career flourished. She accepted a management position, purchased her first home, and gradually built a future defined by stability rather than survival. For the first time, she felt secure. Friends became family. Professional success replaced old insecurities. She wasn't wealthy, but she had achieved something more valuable. She had built a life nobody could take away from her. Then, almost unexpectedly, news from her hometown began reaching her through relatives and former neighbors. David Carter had retired earlier than expected. Susan's health was declining. Financial issues that had been hidden for years were becoming public knowledge. Their marriage appeared strained. And Ryan, the son who had always been treated as the family's golden child, was struggling in ways nobody anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on Emily. Growing up, everyone assumed Ryan would thrive while she would struggle. Instead, life unfolded differently. Ryan had spent years relying on support systems that eventually disappeared. Without constant protection, he found it difficult to navigate setbacks. Relationships failed. Employment became inconsistent. The confidence everyone mistook for strength turned out to be dependence. Meanwhile, Emily had developed resilience because she had no choice. Every challenge she faced forced her to adapt. Every obstacle taught her something new. Over time, those lessons accumulated into strength. Then one afternoon, nearly 10 years after the night she was kicked out, Emily received a voicemail. The moment she heard the voice, her heart stopped. It was David Carter. For several seconds, she considered deleting the message without listening further. Instead, she sat down and let it play. The man speaking sounded older, tired, different. He wasn't calling to argue. He wasn't calling to defend past decisions. He was calling because he wanted to talk. At first, Emily ignored the message. Then another arrived. Then another. Weeks passed. Eventually, curiosity overcame resistance. She agreed to meet him in a public restaurant halfway between their towns. When David walked through the door, Emily barely recognized him. Age had changed him. Life had changed him. The confidence he carried throughout her childhood seemed gone. They spoke cautiously at first. Conversation remained polite but distant. Then David began discussing the past. He admitted mistakes. He acknowledged failures. He described years spent convincing himself that he had done the right thing. According to him, it took losing relationships, watching his family fracture, and facing his own regrets to realize how wrong he had been. He admitted that when conflict arose between Emily and the rest of the household, choosing the easier path often felt simpler than confronting uncomfortable truths. Instead of protecting his daughter, he protected the illusion that everything was under control. For the first time in her life, Emily heard her father accept responsibility. The conversation lasted nearly 4 hours. Neither person left unchanged. Yet one question remained. What about Susan? Months later, Emily agreed to meet her mother. The encounter was emotional, uncomfortable, and filled with long silences. Susan cried frequently. She admitted carrying guilt for years. She described living with fears she never properly addressed. She acknowledged showing favoritism toward Ryan and treating Emily unfairly. None of the explanations erased what happened, but hearing them mattered. For years, Emily had imagined what an apology might sound like. The reality was far more complicated. There were no perfect words, no speech capable of repairing everything. There was only honesty. Then came one final revelation. Susan admitted that the night Emily was thrown out, she expected her daughter to return within a few days. She never imagined Emily would build an entirely new life. She assumed family ties would eventually pull her back. By the time she realized how serious the damage was, years had passed. Pride prevented anyone from reaching out. Each year made the silence harder to break. What began as a terrible decision evolved into a decade of separation. That realization hit everyone hard. An entire family had lost years together because nobody was willing to take the first step. In the years that followed, relationships improved slowly. Trust returned gradually rather than instantly. Some wounds healed. Others remained. Emily never forgot what happened, but she refused to let it define the rest of her life. Forgiveness, she learned, wasn't about pretending the past never occurred. It was about refusing to carry its weight forever. David Carter spent his remaining years trying to rebuild relationships he once took for granted. Susan worked to become more honest about her mistakes. Ryan eventually confronted his own shortcomings and began taking responsibility for his future. None of their journeys were easy, but each represented growth that should have happened years earlier. As for Emily, she discovered something remarkable. The worst moment of her life had also become the moment that revealed her strength. Being forced out at 18 nearly destroyed her. Yet it also taught her independence, resilience, and self-worth. The people who once doubted her unintentionally showed her what she was capable of becoming. And perhaps that is the lesson at the heart of this story. Sometimes rejection feels like the end of everything. Sometimes betrayal arrives from the people you trust most. Sometimes doors close in ways that seem impossible to understand. But years later, when you look back, you may discover that the path you never wanted to walk became the very path that led you to the life you were meant to build. If you were in Emily's position, would you have forgiven David and Susan Carter after everything that happened? Or would you have left the past behind forever? Let us know in the comments below.